joining us tonight. I'm just going to go over the agenda really quick. So we're a little bit behind schedule, but from 6:30 to 6:40, actually, Shaykh Fuad is actually going to start with Quran recitation. After which Shaykh Yasir will be reviewing the preparation for death, importance of a will, and what we can do to support those that have passed. After that, Brother Imtiaz, who is going to be the coordinator for the Janazas here at Al-Falah, he's going to speak to you for about 15 minutes around the logistics of death and burial, as well as hospice care. And then inshallah from 7 to 7:15 we'll have a Q&A. Jazakallah khair.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الذي خلقني فهو يهدين والذي هو يطعمني ويسقين الذي خلقني فهو يهدين والذي هو يطعمني ويسقين وإذا مرضت فهو يشفين والذي يميتني ثم يحيين والذي أطمع أن يغفر لي خطيئتي يوم الدين رب هب لي حكما وألحقني بالصالحين واجعل لي لسان صدق في الآخرين واجعلني من ورثة جنة النعيم واغفر لأبي إنه كان من الضالين ولا تخزني يوم يبعثون يوم لا ينفع مال ولا بنون إلا من أتى الله بقلب سليم ولا تخزني يوم يوم لا ينفع مال ولا بنون إلا من أتى الله بقلب سليم صدق الله العظيم.
بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد في الأولين وصل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد في الآخرين وصل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ومولانا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم في الملأ الأعلى إلى يوم الدين. الحمد لله ثم الحمد لله. الحمد لله الذي بنعمته تتم الصالحات. It is only by the grace of Allah and His generosity do righteous affairs transpire. So we are thankful to Allah and we praise Him for His generosity. We thank Him for the blessing of the house of Allah, His house. We thank Him for the blessing of the Quran. May Allah bless Shaykh Fuad and all of those who recite the Quran for us. May Allah increase them, Ya Rab. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless and we thank Him for salah. We thank Him for ritual worship. We thank Him for the deen. We thank Him for our religion. We thank Him for the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu. Coming in these spaces in a state of gratitude and humility as we are gathering in this space, trying to learn something about our deen. Today, inshallah, we're going to be reflecting a little bit on some of the more detailed expectations of the believer in terms of planning for death. Because it is the case very often that people are a little bit oblivious to the reality of death. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كُلُّ نَفْسٍ ذَائِقَةُ الْمَوْتِ. Every nafs, every soul must experience death. وَمَا تَدْرِي نَفْسٌ مَاذَا تَكْسِبُ غَدًا وَمَا تَدْرِي نَفْسٌ بِأَيِّ أَرْضٍ تَمُوتُ. You have no idea what you will acquire tomorrow, and you certainly have no idea in which land you will die. And the Prophet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, إِنَّكَ مَيِّتٌ إِنَّهُمْ لَمَيِّتُونَ. O Muhammad, your reality is that you are dead, and they are dead. And this is in reference to the fact that our realities as individuals are far more synonymous with death than it is with life. Meaning that our existence on this earth is very superficial. Our quote-unquote lives that feel so big and robust, and we experience it with such intensity. We experience life very viscerally. The pains, the sorrows, the worries, the concerns. But it's all, a mirage. Death is our reality. And so all of us are here really effectively awaiting our death. Sayyidina Ali, may Allah be pleased with him, he says, Ya ibn Adam, innama anta ayyam. O son of Adam, you're just merely a number of days. إِذَا ذَهَبَ يَوْمُكَ بَعْضُكَ. If one of your days pass, then a piece of you has passed. So imagine your life as a grid. And let's say your particular grid is 64 squares, and someone else's particular grid is 84. How many more squares do you have in your grid actually left? Do you have 10 squares left? 50 squares left? How many squares left do you have on your grid? Maybe you have 1 square left, and all the previous squares have been filled out. That's it. So death is a reality that we have to become far more intimately aware of on a spiritual level. Prophet ﷺ tells the Sayyidah Aisha in a hadith, أَكْثِرُوا مِن ذِكْرِ هَذِمِ اللَّذَّاتِ. Remember abundantly the destroyer of pleasures, which is death. Death comes, and as Sayyidina Ali says, Al-Maut yafdahu al-Hayah. Death comes to expose life for what it is. Nothing. It comes to expose. SubhanAllah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to be prepared for death. May our hearts and minds and our spirits be in a state of readiness for this certain reality that is going to come, whether very close, or in a few years, or a year, or 10 years, or in a minute. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it that all of us, the best moment in our dunyawi lives is at the moment of death. May the best of our existence on this earth be at our moment of death. May Allah not take our souls until He is fully content and pleased with us as His servants, and that He looks upon us with an eye of acceptance. Allahumma ameen. So inshallah, I just wanted to get into some of the practicalities, more of the fiqhi considerations for death. Reason being, it is quite stark how often I have personally experienced people who have died and there was zero preparation for their death. There is a particular instance that I'm thinking of an individual, Muslim, who was cremated by his family. And they brought the urn to the masjid. They brought me the urn with the cremated body. And I said, what is this? They said, well, what's wrong? I'm like, you can't do this. And they had no idea. They had no conception that you can't cremate a body in Islam. It's haram. Haram to cremate a body in Islam. They brought a cremated body. I know people who were Muslim, their families were not Muslim, and these individuals ended up being buried according to a Catholic or a Christian service, because this person had zero preparation was put into his death. And so his family did what they would do. They wanted, for example, in this particular case, there was a Hispanic family. They wanted a proper Catholic burial, and that's what they did for their loved one. For them, that's the best thing they can do. I can tell you, unfortunately, there are many of these incidents, in particular in the West. So preparation is essential. Making sure that you know exactly what you want at the moment of death is critical. And one of the critical ways for you to instantiate this is through a will, as Brother Zahid noted. All of us, Prophet ﷺ says, you should not sleep 2 or 3 nights except that you have a will written. So from the preparedness measures for death is write your will. And alhamdulillah, we have people in the community who can help with such endeavors, lawyers, etc., who've kind of developed a little bit of this system. You can also go online and download through some of the Islamic websites like ISNA and others. You can download the Islamic will, just to kind of as a simple document until maybe you get a more official document with a lawyer. But everyone should know exactly what they want for themselves when they die. So sometimes you actually have to write out, depending on your family, where exactly you expect to be buried and how, what method, etc., and so on and so forth. MashaAllah, on the flip side, there's plenty of people that we would be sitting in the masjid, for example, and non-Muslims would show up and say, listen, our father passed away, my husband passed away or whatever. They were Muslim, we're not, and we just want to make sure that they get buried according to the way that they lived, which is Muslim. But you can't leave it up to chance, and that's the point that I'm making. All right? I'm giving you some of the more extreme examples, but you should also factor for yourself, making sure that, for example, one of the things that are essential is that you are clean and you are cleansed of all of your burdens, in particular, the debts that may be owed to others. The Prophet ﷺ, one day he was praying, and then after salah, in a very odd fashion, he rushed out of salah and left. And so he came back a little while later, and then they asked him, Ya Rasulullah, what happened? He said, I had some sadaqah for the Muslimin in my room, and I remembered as soon as I finished salah, so I rushed to go and disperse the sadaqah, because the Prophet ﷺ did not want to pass while still having that sadaqah in his hand. So from the things that you have to be very mindful of and prepared for is that people may be owed something from you. You can't just leave that up to your family to like kind of hopefully they're going to take care of it. No, it has to be known what debts you owe, you know, and who there's people who may have things, belongings, maybe perhaps something you borrowed that someone is owed. You can't just assume that they're going to forgive, you know. Negligible things like you borrowed a pen, inshallah, things that are negligible and can be forgotten, that's one thing, right? And hopefully there's a social pact where negligible things we kind of forgive one another on. And that's why it's good as a common practice from the adab of the believer is to always forgive the Muslimin. Just that if, for example, we do this when we're going to Umrah, we're going to Hajj, etc. We say, Allah, I forgive all of my brothers and sisters, and if anyone is owed anything, I forgive it, right? It's good to do those practices. Now, some of the more big ticket items, someone owes you $100,000, you may not be as generous. But nonetheless, you should do that proactively towards others. But, however, when it comes to you and what you may owe people, make sure that you write down that someone knows exactly what you owe and what people have or should receive from what you have in your belongings. Now, when it comes to the actual death, there is the fiqh of as the person is dying, which is extremely critical for us to learn about. Because there's a lot of mistakes that people make in this space. People don't understand the gravity on the spiritual plane of what's happening at the moment of death. And very often people get caught up in nonsensical things. They get caught up in the moment of the calamity. Sometimes people get so caught up in their emotions, they lose sight of the fact that they have a loved one who has rights. This person that's sitting in front of you on the hospital bed or in your home that is about to die or that is dying has distinct rights upon us. And so I want us to learn these rights so that inshallah, when Allah wills and these realities transpire in our lives with our loved ones, etc., that we know what to do to our brothers and for our brothers and sisters. From the first things that we have to do at the moment of ihtidar, this is called, as death is happening, it's called ihtidar. The word ihtidar, the root of it is hadara. And hadara means to be present. Now, what that is in reference to is the presence of the angels. So ihtidar is when now the angel of death and the angels are present. Yahdurun, they're present and they're witnessing this death. Or it also means when the nafs, the soul, is in a space of hudur of Allah, right? It is now in the presence of Allah. Khalas, the soul is going to leave the body to be in the divine possession. And so that's also from the reasons of its being called ihtidar. Now, in that space, the first thing that is important is a talqeen. What's important in that moment is that the utterance of La ilaha illallah is happening. Now, Imam al-Nawawi, one of the great Shafi'i scholars, he says, do not say to someone who's dying, qul. Don't say, qul la ilaha illallah. Don't tell them and say la ilaha illallah. Because if you put it in the command form, in their disheveled or disoriented state, they may reject. They may say no. And you don't want to set them up to fail, So you don't say to someone who's dying, say la ilaha illallah. You just utter la ilaha illallah. So as you're present, you say la ilaha illallah, la ilaha illallah. In a very gentle, kind, loving way, you're saying la ilaha illallah. What's interesting is Imam Nawawi also says that you don't have to say Muhammadun Rasulullah. Because la ilaha illallah encompasses Muhammadun Rasulullah. And because for the person who's dying, saying Muhammad Rasulullah is heavier than saying la ilaha illallah. So say it right now, la ilaha illallah. Very easy on the tongue. Muhammad requires more work in the mouth. The tongue's having to contract and constrict. And so if you've seen, Jazakallah khair, Shaykh Fuad, Barakallahu fikum. I didn't even know. Karamakum Allah for the tea. I was absent-minded. Muhammad Rasulullah is heavy. So in that case, they say that La ilaha illallah suffices. However, if you see that the person is capable, then it's recommended certainly to say Muhammadun Rasulullah, right? But what's critical is La ilaha illallah, right? La ilaha illallah. Now, at the time of death, from the critical sunnah is husnul dhanna billah, meaning that the person who's dying, we want to encourage them to have the best possible opinion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that moment. Prophet ﷺ says that لا يموتن أحدكم, none of you should die إلا وهو يحسن الظن بالله, except that they have a good opinion of Allah. And this famous incident with Prophet ﷺ walked upon a young man who was dying, and he said to the young man, "How are you?" He said, "Ya Rasulullah, arju rahmatillah wa akhsha adhabah." You know, I have hope in the mercy of Allah, but I'm fearful of His punishment. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, "Majtama'a fi qalbi mu'min," these two qualities, when they are together in the heart of a believer, then this believer will be saved from hellfire. So this is what it means to have a good opinion of Allah, to have both hope and fear. Someone who was once very ill and you know, for them death was imminent, they said, "I'm very, very fearful and I feel like it's overtaking me." I said, fear is very healthy. You just have to balance it with hope, right? It's not good to just be, you know, blindly hopeful, and it's not good to also be immersed in paralyzing fear. No, you have to be balanced between hope and fear. So in that state, what do we tell people? We say to them, you know, Alhamdulillah, Allah's so forgiving, Allah's so merciful, Allah's so loving, He's so kind, He's so compassionate. Allah has preserved 99% of His mercy in the afterlife. He only brought one of His mercies into this world. You know that. We're only negotiating one of God's mercies in this world. He left 99% of them for the afterlife, for the Day of Judgment. So Allah's mercy is all for us on the Day of Judgment, because that's when the greatest mercy we're going to need on that day. So you sit there and you remind your loved ones, even yourself, if the case is that you are the one who's passing, have a good opinion of Allah. Have certainty that He's forgiving, that He's merciful. Ask Allah for forgiveness. From the adab, from the fiqh of this moment, is you say, Astaghfirullah wa atubu ilayh. You make tawbah. You repent to Allah. If Allah blesses you, that you are conscious in that moment, then you should certainly be making istighfar and tawbah. And the people who are around the one who is in a state of ihtidar should also remind this person, you know, make tawbah. Astaghfirullah wa atubu ilayh. Remind them to repent, because this is not a time to show them their favorite show. You know, sometimes people do this. Turn on their favorite music. We just want to create a nice, cute, you know, loving environment. No. This is we're trying to transition. We're trying to transition. We want to come into a deeply spiritual plane. This is a time of seeking forgiveness, a time of repentance. From the fiqh of this moment is reading Quran, right? In the Musnad of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal is a riwayah that indicates that from the Sahaba they would read Quran, and from the surah that would be read, right, over the ages is Surah Yasin. Because there are some athar and riwayat that indicate that Surah Yasin at the time of death, it lessens the blow of death. So certainly reading Quran at the time of death is essential. Some of the surah that, you know, there's a riwayah that said that someone read Surah Al-Baqarah, others recommend Surah Yasin, but any part of the Quran, inshallah, is khair. You can read Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah Yasin, etc. But this should be happening as a person is dying. So you're in the hospital room, you're reading the Quran, you're turning on the Quran, in particular these surah, inshallah. You know, this is not a time to be wailing, I'm going to miss you, they're not going to remember any of that. So, you know, I understand the emotions that I'm feeling are so intense, I want to kind of dump them on the person, but the person is in a different reality. It's not, you know, no matter how painful this is to hear, it's not about what you're going through emotional, it's about what they need, right? And that's a very, you know, difficult thing to negotiate. But you have to have the presence of mind to understand, how can I truly maximize this individual's welfare? I love them. I want the best for them. Let me maximize how much goodness I can give. So repentance, saying La ilaha illallah, saying husnul dhanna billah, having a good opinion of Allah, reading the Quran. These are all essential sunan and adab in this moment. When the person passes, from the adab is also to moisten the lips, of the person who is dying. And this was a practice that was done. We saw it in the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the life of Sayyidina Umar, Sayyidina Abu Bakr, that their loved ones would moisten their lips. The reason you moisten the lips is so that you make their, the body is beginning to kind of come into certain states, and things can become very dry, and it can become very hard to move. So you moisten the lips so that you make it easier for them to remember, right? Some indicate that it's also for ease of tulu' ruh, for ease of the exit of the soul. And regardless, this remains a good adab that should be done, which is to moisten the lips. Now, when the person passes, the first thing that you should do is you say, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, to Allah we belong and to Allah we shall return, and you close their eyes. The Prophet ﷺ did this because he was sitting in a gathering with the companions, and he was telling them that he was teaching them this exact point, and he said that when someone dies and you see their eyes, because the eye, when the eyes kind of go, they say like falls back into the back of their head, the eye is following their soul. That's what's happening. The eyes are following the soul as it's exiting the body. And so the companions who have been experiencing death all their lives never knew that the eyes were following the soul. So the whole audience became overwhelmed. And they started to say Allahu Akbar, and they were so overwhelmed by the power of this idea, that the eyes are doing this motion because it's following the soul. So the Prophet ﷺ said, when you see this, you take and you close their eyes shut. So you close the eyes of the individual shut. And you should not proclaim things that are negative in that moment. Sometimes, I'm sure every culture has this version, the version of this. But for example, in Egypt, Egyptians will say things like, Ya lahwi, Ya kharabi, Ya mish arif. They'll say like very intense, exaggerative language that is negative. Ya lahwi, lahu means frivolousness. So like, people will scream this, in a way of like, oh, what a frivolous reality that's transpiring. Or ya kharabi. Kharabi means destruction. Oh, my destruction. These are expressions of like grief and pain, but they are not what is to be said in that moment. So be mindful of the words you're uttering, because everything, especially when you say ya, it's a form of dua, an extolling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you want to make sure that in those moments, you immediately begin to make dua for this individual with maghfirah, that Allah forgives them, that Allah bestows His best and kindest graces upon them. Okay? What you should do for the person that has passed as well is, with the dua, is that you now begin to prepare them for the transition, which is through the process of washing and things of that nature, bi'idhnillah. So I'll just pause now for our dear brother to come and share some of the he'll come and share some of the particular details of what is expected of us, inshallah, because now our dear brother is going to be the one who perhaps, can you introduce? And then I will resume with some more reflections, and then we'll open up the floor for some Q&A, because I have a lot of questions that have come in about the particularities of end-of-life care, things that have to do with like pulling the plug, removing machines, ventilating systems, things of that nature. So we'll get into some of those questions, but I just want to give some space for our brother to share his thoughts, and then we'll reconvene. Barakallahu feek.
Barakallahu feek. Shaykh Yasir. I'm just going to introduce Brother Imtiaz Siamwala. He is going to be the coordinator for the Janaza services here at Al-Falah. Inshallah, we're in the process of prepping the room, or it's almost complete, so soon we'll be offering that service, inshallah. Just a little bit about his background. He has 20 years of experience in program and project management. He's helped with the janazas at Masjid Al-Wali, as well as MCNJ. And he's handled several cases in relation to, I guess, different types of janazas, including the elderly, COVID cases, homicides. So Brother Imtiaz is going to go over, I guess, the logistical process and what it's going to look like at Al-Falah, inshallah. Brother Imtiaz.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Zaid. First and foremost, I'm humbled to be sharing a stage with my beloved Sheikh. It's an honor and privilege. Very quickly, want to also thank Al-Falah management for giving me this opportunity to serve the community. This has been my passion, working on Janaza preparation for quite a good number of years. And Alhamdulillah, with the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so far, I have serviced more than 200 cases in the various masajids that I have been associated with, and looking forward to working with Al-Falah as well. When a person passes away, there are a few things that we as family members need to keep in mind. We usually don't prepare for these kind of situations. Like the Sheikh rightly said in the beginning, when the time comes, we are caught like a deer in front of headlights. We have no clue what needs to be done. So from that point of view, I'll talk about the process and procedure when you come across a situation in your family, your loved one, and what do you need to do, what do you need to know. First and foremost, in the case of people who are still alive but in the end of life situation, let's say they are either in home hospice or they are in a hospital and the doctors have kind of given you an indication that this is an end of life situation. In that case, a couple of things you as a family member need to know so that you are preparing for the ultimate, which is a janaza of your loved one. Some of the things the Sheikh has already touched upon, one of the most important thing is, closing the eyes. A few other things I will add on to that is when you have a loved one that is in a hospital setting on life support or even in the house, if they have any external devices inserted into them, please make sure as soon as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made a decision to take your loved one away, make sure right away you let the people who are taking care of your loved one in the hospital or the nurse who is coming home for home hospice visits, you let them know to take away all the external devices from the body kind of immediately, because at this time the body is still flexible, and if there are any needles and drips, any catheters, the body will still function in a way that it may try to close up the opening. You can remove it later on when the body stiffens, it is okay, but it's a big possibility that there will be leaks from those openings. Those are very difficult to patch after the fact. So if you do it quickly, it will be easier for your loved one. Then there won't be too much of patching or trying to stop the leakage. That is one thing I would like to recommend. The other thing is a lot of our Muslim families are not aware of how the body needs to be placed when a person dies. And this can only be done when the person has kind of like just passed away and the body is flexible. After the body stiffens up, some of these things are difficult, and we don't realize this, but we should keep this in mind, is the hands usually, the staff in the hospital, they are used to working on non-Muslim cases, and most of them are from other faiths which have traditions that we don't follow. So the staff is accustomed to putting the hands together, like let's say for the Hindus or the Christians, like though, as though they are in the state of prayer, right? And that is something that we don't do. But there are so, by default, they are trained to, okay, if somebody dies, we have to bring the hands together, they'll tie the hands together, which is a no-no. You want to request them to have the hands on the sides. Okay, this is all possible, like I said, when the body is still flexible. But let's say, you are in the house. The hospital staff did what they had to do. They put the hands together, they tied it up. Now the body is stiff. Please do not go and force it to bring the hands on the side. If you're able to do this without applying any force, Bismillah, go ahead and do it. But at this point, it's qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you can move, fine. If you cannot move, that's okay as well. We accept it as is. Even in case of the external devices, there are certain tubings that may be attached to organs, okay? And the staff may not be equipped to undo the pipe from the organs within the body because they may have been, inserted at a time of an operation maybe. So that is qadr of Allah. You leave it as is. You're not gonna try to pull it out because if you do, you're gonna cause some damage, right? So let's not do that as well. Try as much as possible, which you can do easily, but there is no applying force. That's the second point I wanted to say. And thirdly, if possible, try to tilt the head towards the right side so that when you put this person in the box for burial, the face will be facing the Qibla, inshallah. We'll come to the box later on, and maybe Shaykh will address that, as a part of the fiqh as well. But some things I want to point out is, in this country especially where, we have to follow rules and regulations, and inshallah Shaykh will validate that we have to follow the rule of the land, right? So there are certain sunnahs we will not be able to keep because the rule of the land is to follow whatever guidance the state, the city, or the cemetery has enforced on us. So for example, in the era of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there was no casket, there was no box. But today we will be using a box, right? It's not a sunnah, we are breaking a sunnah, but we are following the regulations that we are governed by, right? So these kind of things, I think, from a fiqh point of view, Shaykh may want to address that, but these are the kind of things that you will face. We cannot follow the sunnah 100%, but we can follow the best we can, right? Now, let's come back to our subject of, preparing for death. So a death can occur in a few different situations. A person was home, they passed away naturally, they were elderly, they were in home hospice, they passed away, no problem. In any case, you will have to inform your local police authorities. They will bring a medical examiner to your house and they will clear whether the body is ready for last rites, meaning Salat al-Janaza and burial. If a person is young, died home without any illness, this becomes a little more tricky because at this time, the medical examiner wants to make sure that there is no foul play. In this case, what they want to do is they want to take the deceased with them to their office to perform an autopsy. Now, you as a family, you have the right to request to the medical examiner that your religion does not allow tampering of the body. So there is a very simple form, denial of autopsy. You can fill up that form and you can hand it over to the medical examiner to stop the autopsy. End of the day, the decision will remain with the medical examiner. If they feel that this is going to help, like in the case of the pandemic, right? A lot of people started dying due to the COVID-19, and the government wanted to get to the root cause of it. So a person who has died with COVID-19, the government has the right to perform the autopsy, even though you may come up and say, hey, my religion doesn't allow the government has the right to overwrite your religious belief in this situation. Similarly, with other cases, somebody who's died young, they may want to get to the bottom of it, of how this brother or sister has died, so that they can make, some kind of remediation for it for future cases of that nature. So end of the day, the decision will lie with the medical examiner whether or not to perform the autopsy, but you have the right to request, and they may or may not honor your request. This is in case of somebody that has died in the house. In the case that somebody has died in the hospital, or let's say an accident case out on the street, or somebody was just at work, they dropped dead of a heart attack or anything else outside of the house, most likely the body will end up in one of the two places, right? It will end up, if the person is injured, in the hospital and then may die in the hospital, or they have died already, let's say on a street in an accident, the body will end up with the medical examiner's office, right? So in case of death, the body can be in one of the three places. It will be either in your house, if they died naturally, or however else in the house, or if they died at work or on the street or in the train or in the bus or wherever else, the medical examiner got a hold of the body is with the medical examiner. And the third place the body can be is at the hospital. So in the later two cases, in the case where the body is at the hospital or at the medical examiner's office, the process is a little simpler for you to begin with funeral or loss rites, is because now you're working with the authorities to get a death certificate signed. Now this portion that I'm telling you is extremely important. Everybody needs to be aware. No matter how the person has died at home or in the hospital or wherever else, a burial permit cannot be issued until the doctor has signed an electronic death record. There is a system provided by the state of New Jersey. It is called electronic death record system. The hospitals, the doctors, the funeral homes, and all the people who are associated with a funeral have access to this system. So what happens is, a nurse or the hospital staff may enter data into it of the demographic detail of the person who has passed away, and then the doctor needs to log in and sign this document electronically. Until the doctor signs, whoever is working on funeral preparations, cannot get a burial permit issued for the burial. And this signature is the most crucial part in reference to getting a burial moved forward. As we all know, our faith tells us that we need to bury our loved one as soon as possible. And this is one of the biggest roadblocks. Because what happens a lot of times, the doctors or the nurses or the hospital facilities, they are not aware of our religious need that we need to bury right away. In their experience, most of the cases, the funeral take place over the weekend. Somebody died Monday, they may have the body sitting in a morgue or in a funeral home because they want to have the service over the weekend. So the doctor is not going to rush into signing electronic death certificate right away, unless you insist upon them that, look, my faith demands that I bury my loved one right away, in a matter of hours actually. So even when the doctor has, let's say, given you the word that, okay, we have a couple of hours, we are on life support, we are going to remove life support, and in a matter of hours, this person is going to pass away. At that time, you want to begin this conversation that whenever Allah makes a decision, we want you to sign this electronic death certificate right away, because now we want to make arrangements for the burial. Okay, so that's a very crucial point. You must insist upon them. And you as a family has more leverage on the hospital staff, on the doctor's office, because you are the next of kin. People from the masjid, people from the funeral home, people from the cemetery will not be able to make that difference on the hospital. You as the next of kin will have more leverage. So please keep that in mind. If that comes into your family, make sure you are aware of the situation. Once all this thing is done, now we have to prepare for the Salat al-Janaza. For that, we need to hire a licensed funeral home. No matter where you get the service from, a masjid, or you got recommended by somebody, said, okay, A, B, and C funeral home, we worked with them, they are good, let's go ahead and hire them. So what will happen is this funeral home now will pick up the loved one either from your house after it has been cleared by the medical examiner for the funeral service, or from the hospital, or from the medical examiner's office. The body cannot be moved without a licensed funeral home, okay? In our case, we will be working with some licensed funeral homes that have been recommended. We have experience working with them. So whenever you have a case and you come to the masjid, inshallah, we will recommend the few people that we work with and the process that goes on. But just to touch very quickly, I know I'm running out of time, but in the next 5 minutes or so, inshallah, I'll just try to give you the process very quickly. So the funeral home will pick up your loved one either from the house, the hospital, or the medical examiner's office. And now you're going to have to wash your loved one. In this masjid, inshallah, on the 20th of December, we are going to hold a seminar on how to perform a ghusl. We're going to have separate sessions for brothers and sisters. I think the masjid management will share those details with you shortly. But far as the ghusl is concerned, you as a family member should participate in the ghusl of your loved one. If you don't know how to lead the process, at least you should know the etiquettes of washing, which is what you will learn in this session, inshallah. And you should actually train yourself whenever the time comes on you, your family, you are ready to do the ghusl yourself, right? You shouldn't be dependent on the masjid, on the funeral home, on a third party to wash your loved one. I think Sheikh may want to touch up on that as well during the Q&A. But the ghusl is the next part. And like I said, the rules that we have to follow in this country is we need to have a casket. So after the washing and shrouding, we will place the body in a simple box, and that box will then be brought into the masjid for the Salat al-Janaza. The Imam of the masjid, inshallah, will lead the Salat al-Janaza unless the family makes a request that they want somebody else to perform, perhaps a family member or whoever else. That will be, depending on how the management of this masjid and the family can agree upon, right? So that is something that can be discussed at a later time. After the Salat al-Janaza, the funeral home will transport the body from the masjid to the cemetery of your choice. Currently in New Jersey, there are 2 cemeteries. Those are completely Muslim owned and operated. One of them is Jersey State Memorial on Route 33 in the town of Millstone. And the other one is Marlboro Muslim Memorial, which is in the town of Marlboro. These 2 cemeteries are completely Muslim owned, and all the burials that are in there are of Muslim brothers and sisters. Apart from that, there are other cemeteries where there are sections for Muslims, and you can certainly avail those services as well. I want to touch the cost factor, and inshallah, I'll turn it over to Sheikh for the Q&A. Far as the cost is concerned, it will vary upon which funeral home you have hired, number one, which cemetery do you want to get your loved one buried, number two, and what does that cemetery charge for opening and closing of the grave. But, to give you like a window, a usual funeral is about $1,600 to $1,800 for a very basic funeral. These are funeral home charges I'm talking about, $1,600 to $1,800. Of course, depending on the case, if there are some difficult cases or if the distance is larger, there may be some additional cost. The second biggest cost is the plot of grave. Like I said, in the Muslim cemeteries today, it's a little difficult to get a plot of grave because most of the graves have been sold to masajids. Individuals have bought it from the masajids, or the masajids are holding So if you want to buy a plot today, it is a challenge, right? It's not an easy task. But on an average, about 15 to 1800, you will be able to buy a plot in either one of the two cemeteries. Far as the opening and closing of the plot goes, it will depend on which cemetery you are working with. In the two cemeteries which are Muslim cemeteries, in Marlborough Muslim Memorial, on a weekday until 4 o'clock, your charges will be $1,200 for opening and closing. After 4 o'clock, they will charge you $300 overtime. In Jersey State Memorial, it would start about $1,500 in a weekday up till 2 o'clock, and then every hour there is an overtime. So if you're over by 1 hour, there may be a $200 overtime. For 2 hours, there may be $400 overtime. Weekdays. In weekends, it will be higher. So those charges are very fluid, and it will all be based on the day and the time of the week, inshallah. But on an average today, the cost of a funeral for a very basic funeral would be around $4,000 to $4,800. So this is basically what the process is. And inshallah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant a good and healthy life to all your family members. But whenever the time comes, please reach out to the masjid of what the process is and how your loved one will be handled when the ghusl room is up and running. And inshallah, we will be able to help you in any situation that you may have. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Barakallahu feek, Brother Imtiaz. Just to add to what Brother Imtiaz was saying before, inshallah on December 10th at 10:45 a.m., we're going to have the Janaza workshop, inshallah, for brothers and sisters separately. Some registration link will go out for anyone that's interested. I'm going to pass the mic over to Brother Khalid now to do the Q&A. Did you?
Okay, no, I have them. Okay, just send me whatever you have here, inshallah.
Okay, inshallah.
So we save time this way. Whatever comes in, you can send it here. Are we taking questions from the audience? Yeah, I have a lot of questions that have come in already. Yeah, I'll start with them, and then if there's follow-up. So I just want to wrap up my thoughts. Barakallahu feekum. I hope you pay attention. This is very valuable information that Brother Imtiaz shared with us about kind of the details. Sure, yeah. So this one's sufficient? Okay. So what he mentioned are very relevant details and information about the procedural considerations. Just going back to some of the religious fiqhi considerations, I stopped off at the point of closing the eyes. From the things that you should also do is cover the body. So even as you're in preparation and waiting, the body should not be exposed, right? So just covering with a simple sheet is from the adab of the person who's passed. And we take this from the Prophet ﷺ. We know that when Sayyidina Abu Bakr was coming from the Ma'ali, or from al-Mu'alla, he was coming from the heights in Medina. He was coming to, he got word that the Prophet ﷺ had passed, and he came, and the Prophet ﷺ was covered in his house. And then he uncovered his face, and he kissed him, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, etc. So it is acceptable for, you should cover. It is acceptable for the loved ones and the very close relatives, in those moments if they want to hug and kiss and connect with the deceased, that's fine. What's not acceptable is what you see happening in other traditions, and unfortunately I'm seeing it a lot in the Muslim community now, which is we've developed our own version of a wake. And this is not acceptable. This is not a part of our tradition. We don't put up the body, and unfortunately I have been to too many janazas like this. In many parts of the country, people put up the body, uncover the face, and the whole congregation kind of comes and looks at the body. That is not from the practice of the Muslimin, okay? That is not our practice. So do not ask for it, because every time I talk to the brothers and the brothers involved in the funeral service, I say, Sheikh, the families asked for it. We don't know what to do. So don't request that, because it's not good for the deceased. It's not from the takreem of the mayyit. From the adab and from the sunnah of dealing with the deceased is something called takreem. Takreem means honoring the deceased. Our dear brother Imtiaz mentioned one of those elements, which is what? At-tasriya, moving swiftly for the burial. The body of the deceased is also sacrosanct, so you can't mutilate it. That's why he was talking about removing of tubes and things of that nature. Just remove, but you can't go invasively to mutilate and change and shift. For example, someone may have a pacemaker inside. You can't do operations to remove the pacemaker. Certain things that are already embedded within the body, that are metals or machines, if it's going to require invasive procedure, you would not do that. But things that are just like poking out or things that can be removed, then certainly. Now, so I wanted to mention this point about not doing the art. Now, but however, you have a loved one who's flying in from overseas, and it's right before the Janaza prayer, and the body's in the room, and they just really want to see, then that's fine, inshallah. That's not haram to look at the body. But we're not going to set up, and I hope inshallah Al-Falah agrees with me on this, you're not going to set up a wake in our community. That's not the practice of Islam, all right? Now, from what's also important in this time of like the Janaza process, which is the going to the cemetery. This is also something that develops, there's a little bit of tension around it, which is who can go to the cemetery. The standard operating procedure is that men are the one who go to the cemetery for the burial. Meaning, the process of the Janaza, which is taking the body, male or female, and going down and putting the body into the grave, that is something that is fulfilled by the men of the Muslim community. With regards to women going to the burial, here, it's a longer story, but I'll give you the gist of it. The gist of it is the following. Women who are not going to be overly emotional and can control, can go to the gravesite, but cannot be in the middle of the burial itself. Because sometimes this also happens. A lot of times this happens, which is the body is going under, and then men and women start to kind of congregate around the burial site. This is not good, right? It is not the practice of Islam and Muslimin. This is something the men should take care of. It's because it's a duty. This is not an honorific thing. This is a responsibility that has to be fulfilled in the manner according to the way of the Prophet ﷺ. So you bury the body, then those women can, inshallah, come when the people have moved off. They can come, inshallah, and stand by the burial site and make dua, etc. So let's not also develop these practices of insisting, right, that I want to be there. That's not something that is in the best interest of the person who's passing, right? The best thing that you can be doing for that person is making dua for them in that moment, reading Quran, making dhikr. From the ad'iyah, I always, whenever I'm in the grave, I always tell brothers, please, stop chatting. A lot of chatting. People, it's as if like we're drinking coffee. This is not time to be chatting. Make this brother or this sister who's passed, they need you, and they need your dua. And from the best dua to be made, as the Prophet ﷺ said, "Ud'u li akhikum, فَإِنَّهُ الْآنَ يُسْأَلُ." Make dua for your brother, for right now he's being questioned. And what that person who's being questioned by the angels needs is thabat. So we make a dua, Allahumma thabbithu, or Allahumma thabbitha inda su'al. Oh Allah, grant them thabat, steadfastness as they are being questioned. Allahumma thabbithu inda su'al. Allahumma thabbithu inda su'al. Allahumma thabbitha inda su'al, etc. So make dua. Another practice, so these are, I'm just going to rush through because I have a lot of questions. Another important practice is that when the person is now buried, and the shaykh or whoever is there makes dua, for example, and we say ameen and etc., and then everyone leaves, the loved ones should stay behind for a minimum of 45 minutes to an hour. This is a recommended practice so that they are with them in the most difficult times of the transition, which is the period of questioning. So the ulama, they say, anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour of remaining behind and making dua for your loved one. And I think this is a very understandable and conceivable practice for us as brothers and sisters. So those are some of the highlights, inshallah. If I remember anything, I'll jump back because I want to get to some of the questions that were posed as is. The first question I have here is, can you pray janazah over a family member who died not believing in Allah? No. someone who you know does not believe in Allah is not a Muslim, right? Is not a Muslim. And so therefore they are not to receive the janazah of the Muslimin. So you cannot fulfill, you cannot do the Islamic burial rites on that individual. If you're saying you know they do not believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. With regards to respirators, ventilators, when to shut off stillborn baby versus newborn, or stillborn versus a baby born with a heartbeat. Okay, very high level. With regards to babies, let's cover that. Stillborn children, especially before 4 months, there is no janazah for them, okay? That is by the agreement of the fuqaha. Before 4 months, there's no janazah. So the body will be taken and will be buried. It should be buried, but there's no janazah process. It doesn't even need to be washed, per se. But, you know, the hospital would probably just wash it a little bit and that's it. But there's no technical burial rites or rituals required, other than actual burying of the body. For after 4 months, there's a difference of opinion. Some scholars say that after 4 months, there should be a janazah, right? Others say that there should be no janazah up until after the birth. And then we see after the birth, if the child comes out with a heartbeat, then even if it's one heartbeat, then there's a janazah prayer. Or as the Malikiya say, yastahillu sarikha, that comes out of the womb screaming or yelling or something, or having a heartbeat, then that child, even if they die a minute later, you pray janazah on them. If the child is born, even after full 9 months period, stillborn, meaning coming out dead, then that there's no janazah upon that, according to this opinion. So there's a difference of opinion between the fuqaha on this. Experientially, what I've noticed happening is that very often, especially someone who's gone through a longer period of pregnancy, it brings some degree of closure to have the janazah. So, you know, this can be discussed with the services and so on, but, you know, you could, if it's a 6 months or a 7 month and you feel you need some closure, then it's jaiz to have a janazah. It's not as if you cannot have a janazah. That's just, I want to make that clear. You don't have to have one according to the opinions if the child was, you know, stillborn at any point, including when the birthing process happened after 9 months. Is that clear? Brother Imtiaz, you have something to say? Okay. With regards to respirators, ventilators, listen, this is a big issue. End of life termination is it's a sensitive fiqhi matter, something that as shuyukh we have to deal with on the regular. I'll get the, you know, yes, sister. I have to repeat it? Were you paying attention? No. Okay, so there's, when it comes, going back to the baby, with regards to the babies, there's a difference of opinion between the scholars. There are those, so it's full consensus, before 4 months, no janazah. 4 months in the womb, no janazah. After 4 months is when the difference of opinion happens. Some say that after 4 months, you have a janazah. Some say that no, you don't have a janazah, except if the baby is born with a heartbeat. That's the only time you have the janazah. When a baby comes out of the womb and it has a heartbeat, even if it was a premature baby, but if it comes out with a heartbeat. Now, so if it dies, obviously any time within the womb, then any time within the womb, it will not be receiving a janazah. All right, that's the second opinion. Did that clarify it? Okay, very good.
What about the ghusl?
Yeah, if you're going to do a janazah, then you do the ghusl. But you don't have to, that's what I'm saying. If you're going to just bury the child, because, for example, before 4 months, or you're taking the second opinion that says you don't need, then you don't need to do even the ghusl. You don't need to do ritual ghusl. You just bury the baby as is. Or whatever, you know, from the hospital, and that's all. You do put a kafan, you do just put a, you know, a small covering, that's all. But none of the rites and rituals of janazah are due to that child, right, and who died in that state. So with regards to respirators and ventilators, this is going to have to come down to a case-by-case basis. It's important to understand that yes, we can find that if the circumstance is one that someone is, dead, for all intents and purposes, brain dead, there's, that now they're functioning purely off of the machines, and the machines are doing all the work for them, then, a lot of our fuqaha are beginning to indicate that these are cases where you can remove the machines, right? Because this person is clinically dead. So then the machines can be removed. We don't believe in euthanasia. So we don't, find someone who has a functional heart, a functional mind, a functional this, but they're terminally ill, they're gonna die maybe in a month or two, and just kind of let's just end them now. We don't do that in Islam, right? Which is common practice, right? Now, one of the points in this regard is, do you have to seek medical attention? Absolutely. And this goes back to the do not resuscitate, right? Can you sign a DNR? Yes, you can have a do not resuscitate. So it's not, from an Islamic legal perspective, obligatory to resuscitate someone whose heart has stopped. So if someone, a Muslim, decides to say, I don't want to be resuscitated because, it can be very violent, they break the chest cavity, etc., and you don't want this to be done for you, then you don't have to, you do not have to have it, right? So it's not an obligation to keep the person alive in this, I'm going to use a complicated word, but exaggerated fashion, because today modern medicine has made it where we can keep people alive in a very exaggerated way, in a way that, the same people just a few decades ago would not have survived. So you can choose to opt out of certain medical procedures under the guise of at-tadawi laysa biwajib. Not all medicines are obligatory to be taken, right? So you can choose to opt out and say, I don't want, right? If there's going to be some super invasive procedures where we can go and there's a test drug that you can do this and do that and you're going to go through this, the person says, I'm okay, I don't want to go through all that, that's fine, right? These are some, I'm just giving some cases, but when it comes to the need for a fatwa to remove the ventilator, then you have to contact the sheikh in that moment. You have to contact one of the local scholars and give the particularities of your case, because not all the cases are the same, right? We have to understand what exactly is the cognitive function of this individual, what's happening with the heart, what are the role of these machines in the current state of the individual, etc., and that will give greater insight into whether you can proverbially pull the plug or not. Okay, so you shouldn't just, this happens very often, the medical staff will just do their procedural thing, hospitals do what hospitals do, and the families, just naively follow suit. The doctor says do this, and so we do that. No, the doctor's not a sheikh or a faqih. The doctor will be a critical part of answering the questions that are necessary from a medical perspective so that the shari'i decision can be made. So we do need, obviously, very often I will have to talk to the doctor and say, understand, okay, explain to me this detail and that detail, and then therefore we will, whatever. I'm also personally someone who does not make this decision on my own. So I'll usually call one or two other shuyukh because it's, the life of an individual, right? So I have Dr. Hatem al-Hajj on speed dial when it comes to these cases. Others, I'll say, what do you, here's the case, what do you think? And then we'll come to like a basic consensus on, this particular issue or that person who, or whatever case is. So I hope that answers I hope that captures the questions that people, the questioner was asking about. In terms of suicide, this is a very important one. Suicide is haram, and there is very grave and intense prophetic language around the person who commits suicide. May Allah, protect us and bless us and protect our children and all of us, Ya Rab. Now, the person who commits suicide does not die as a kafir, meaning from our perspective, this person is not someone who is a disbeliever. This is someone who died having committed a grave sin. What's going to happen with this person between them and Allah? The Prophet ﷺ spoke about that in the hadith May Allah protect us. It's very grave and it's very intense, but that does not impact the fact that this person is still due an Islamic burial, right? And this is a big confusion that people have. They think, oh, because the person, committed suicide, then they don't receive a religious burial. That's not the case. They do. However, what the scholars say in the books of fiqh is that this person should not be preyed upon by the imam. Meaning, because it is such a grave sinful act, this person receives the same ruling as someone who, let's say someone is a murderer, a mass murderer, right? Someone who committed like a grave, grave sin. This happened with some of these like bomber kids, right? In Boston and whatever. Who prays janazah? The imam of the community doesn't go pray janazah on someone like that, because you do not glorify acts of evil, acts of wrong. Is that clear? So that person should just be prayed upon by, anyone. It can be the person who's just, anyone who's like facilitating the janazah or whatever. Brothers who are present, just pray the janazah quietly and move on, right? Now, in the case when, and this has happened with me a number of occasions, someone has committed suicide but no one knows, except maybe the mother or the father, like the parents, but no one else knows. Then in that case, because it's not publicly known, then we don't apply the same rulings, right? It's only when the suicide is known that this person we know committed suicide, because we don't want to celebrate the suicide effectively. If the whole community is present and everyone knows that the person who's being preyed on committed suicide, then there is a tacit almost acknowledgement of this grave sinful act. So when it's known, then what applies is, like I said, a quick, simple burial, Bismillah, and you fulfill all of the rites, right? But it's not some big communal procession. In the case that no one knows except the parents, and this has happened with me at least maybe 5 times, unfortunately, then we don't make an issue of it. Khalas, we pray the janazah normally, community, because the whole community is there. A loved one passed, no one knows. So you just fulfill rites, and it should not be told. You do not tell, hey everyone, by the way, before you pray, this, no. That's hatkul astar. That's someone, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has covered them. You do not expose them unnecessarily, right? I don't mean to speak so bluntly and crassly as if it's like not a major, issue, challenge from a spiritual or communal perspective, but just because we're in like a fiqhi space, so I'm just going through the legal considerations. But certainly, there's a whole other conversation that we need to have communally around suicide. And I think I've touched upon this in maybe some of my khutab here, inshallah. Transferring body to another country, that is not recommended. Not recommended to transfer bodies from country to country. The practice of Islam is that wherever you're buried, wherever you die, you should be buried. Because you're exhausting, trust me, to get someone, and Brother Imtiaz, I'm sure, can speak more, in a more knowledgeable fashion on the particularities from a procedural perspective. But I know it takes a lot of work, the embalming process and things of that nature. It's not haram. I'm not saying you cannot do it. Sometimes, for example, this person, many times, or a number of times this has happened where the person died here and has no one. And their whole family is back home. And the family is just anxiously waiting. Bismillah, we don't make it like, this is not our make or break. But it's not a recommended practice, right? So you shouldn't, the recommended practice is you buried where you die, okay? SubhanAllah, what's interesting is, I was in Boston and we were just at a random like rest stop. So SubhanAllah, someone walked into a local grave. I don't know what came over them to just walk into a grave right next to the rest stop. Walked in and started to see Muslim names, but the date of death was like 1915, 1910, 1909, 19 this, with Muslim names. So then we did some research and we found out that there was a contingency of Albanians who were brought because they were skilled laborers at the turn of the century to come and work in like certain mills and factories in Western Massachusetts. And they ended up working and dying and living there. But these were people who came and there was like no markers of Islam or something like that, and they're buried in these like random graves, Muslim names, subhanAllah. Like it was just such a stark reality to see. But that was just an anecdote. But the point is that, you know, it is not recommended. But if it's something that the family insists upon and wants and really needs, or for whatever reason, then it's jaiz, it's allowed. Autopsies, I think he mentioned. Autopsies are not to be done, so we don't mutilate bodies. However, that's very often not our choice. And I've seen many times where I've seen the deceased body and it's, you know, been cut up open because, you know, the medical examiner, they, you know, sometimes want to assess for foul activity or foul play or things of that nature, or cause of death. And these are things that are out of our hands. We can advocate to the best of our ability, we don't want, but if they insist, then khalas. You don't, like, you know, la yukallifu Allahu nafsan illa wusaha. Allah does not burden you more than you can handle. So this is out of your control. The things that are out of your control, don't worry. Your deceased is fine. Nothing haram has happened. You're not doing something that's intrinsically wrong. Same thing with the burial in the boxes. This is the law of the land, right? And I think it has something to do with the topography of, like, the nature of the soil here, because in Massachusetts, in certain places, actually, we don't need the boxes. So, a cement box. Exactly. Sometimes it's a cement box first. And maybe you want to come up, Brother Imtiaz, if people have questions about procedural issues. But sometimes they'll say like a cement box and then, you know, the body. Sometimes it's a wooden box. Sometimes there's no boxes. In the US as well. But it all depends on the locales. طيب. Because we cannot mutilate bodies in Islam. And any type of opening of the body, because, you know, the way autopsies work is a very invasive procedure, and they make very aggressive big cuts. You know, so the way I've seen the bodies that I have seen, you know, it's like from here to here, from here to here, you know, and it just kind of opening up the whole cavity. So
And the skull.
And the skull, yes. And so it can be you can mutilate the human being unnecessarily. So if it's just for like medical curiosity, then that's not something, you know, but if, you know, like for example, in the beginning of COVID, when people were dying and it was completely confusing and stuff, the medical apparatus insisted that these were what were happening for people. So without necessity, right, then there should be no autopsies. Yes, sister. Underground. Yes. Yes, you should be buried in the cemeteries of the Muslimin. That is where you should ideally pursue as a Muslim to be buried, in the cemetery of the Muslimin.
Sheikh,
yes.
I wanted to go back
Please, go
to
ahead,
the autopsy, not the autopsy, the shipping of the body overseas. A very important question. So one of the requirements to ship a body overseas is you have to have an embalming report with the documentation. And the embalming basically consists, without being very gruesome, is removing the fluids from the body of a deceased and then injecting some kind of a chemical which expands, like foam insulation that you may have noticed in your houses. So that is a very gruesome process. Most of the funeral homes that are Muslim funeral homes, they do not provide the embalming services. These are provided by non-Muslims. And can you imagine if your mother or your sister has to go through embalming, a non-Muslim is probably going to perform the embalming without covering the aura, right? Even in a ghusl, we as Muslims, we cover the aura, we respect the privacy of the deceased. But when you send this body for an embalming, that non-Muslim has no idea of what covering of the aura is. Your loved one may be completely without clothes while they're performing the embalming. And that's one of the reasons for you to think about keeping your loved one or whoever else, even though they may have no family, just to explain their family overseas that this is the process that they'll have to go through before we ship them over. But like the Sheikh said, it's a decision by the family. If they so decide that they want to ship overseas, please do not go to a non-Muslim funeral home to get the embalming services. And I'm not gonna go into much detail because some of these are very technical issues, but if there is a case where you want to ship the loved one overseas in spite of all the challenges, then contact me separately. I may be able to provide you an alternative, but unfortunately I won't be able to give you the details in a public forum. These are very sensitive issues. So inshallah, let's connect offline on that. No,
Not necessarily, no.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
I mean, autopsy is in cases of young people specifically who have passed away in the house unattended. That's one of the main reasons. But people who have had a history of illness or people who have reached a certain age, they're not very young, then not necessary that an autopsy is required.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt. If you're here for Salat al-Isha, we're going to do it at 8:15, inshallah, just so we can wrap up the event. Jazakallah khair.
Okay, inshallah. We can even wrap up a little sooner. I don't know if there's other questions. In terms of inheritance, you should certainly follow the inheritance laws of Islam. You can't just leave up to your family to decide this is something that you are going to be incurring a particular sin upon yourself, to just leave it to your families to figure things out, because they may not do it in the appropriate manner. So make sure that you write your will in a manner that represents the inheritance laws of Islam. And this requires some work on your end while you're alive, inshallah. And that's an obligation upon you to do. That's not something that's recommended. You have to do that. All right? There was a question about who can read or who should lead Salatul Janaza. This is an interesting question. The fuqaha are split on this, but the majority will say that the imam, let's say we're in a dawla, we're in like a khilafah, the imam would lead salah first. Then after that, the imam being like the khalifa. Then after that, it would be the senior religious authority who would lead the janazah prayer. So in our cases, what's recommended is certainly that the imam leads, because the imam is the one who has the knowledge of the fiqh, right? So you want to make sure that the janazah prayer is done in the most sound fiqhi perspective. So therefore, a person of knowledge should be the one that leads. Sometimes people are very passionate and they insist that they want to lead the janazah. There are fiqhi opinions that say that the al-musa bihi, that if the person who is died made in their will put someone to lead the janazah, then, for example, I believe it's the Shafi'is who will essentialize that. They'll say that's the person who should lead janazah first and foremost, even over the imam. But for the Hanafis and the Malikis, I know that the imam will trump even who the person put in their wasiyah, in their will. So just for the sake of ensuring that the janazah is done properly, make sure that let the imam do it. Now, if someone comes and they have basic knowledge and they're really passionate and they really want to do it, then inshallah khair. It's not haram, it's not wajib, it's not an obligation that the imam leads, but it's certainly recommended. In terms of organ donation, this is a little bit of a bigger question. The rule is, in general, that it's not categorically prohibited to do organ donation, but it's not categorically allowed to do organ donation either. So there is a little bit of a condition. Like, for example, things like the cornea of the eye can be donated, right? Certain organs can be potentially, this is a difference of opinion now between the fuqaha. There are some opinions, because it all comes to, if one of the maqasid of sharia is the preservation of life, and for example, someone has an organ that will save the life of another, then therefore that will be given precedence over other rulings within the Sharia. So there's a little bit of a discussion with this in the fiqh. So you probably want to reach out if you're considering this. Just understand, because you can't like chop up your body and donate it to science. Which some people do. They'll say like, I want to donate my body to science. No, we don't donate donate the body to science. As long as the general integrity of the body is preserved, okay, then some degree of organ donation is allowed, all right? So that's just a very high level of a much bigger and detailed project. Go ahead.
So, very valid point Sheikh has raised about organ donation. And I'm not going to touch the fiqh aspect of whether
Go ahead.
it's permissible or not, but I'm just going to share my experience with you. A young brother passed away not too long ago, and he had indicated on his driver's license that he wants to donate his organs. This brother was, I think, in his early 20s. Unfortunately, he came to a situation where he was in the end of life for whatever reasons, and the hospital insisted that they would remove the organs, that they had people waiting in line for, organ donors. Now, the parents of this young child, the young person, they were not in alignment with the decision of the young man. They did not want the organs of the youngster to be removed. But since he had it indicated on his driver's license, this became a month-long process. Okay, and the hospital kept him on life support. They would schedule the person who is the receiver of a particular donor, have him in the hospital, prepare him to receive, remove from this person while he's still on life support, organ at a time. And this went on for a month until they couldn't remove any more organs. This went to the courts, and it went to the extent where it could be taken. End of the day, because the youngster had it on his license that he wants to donate, and he was an adult, the hospital had to do what they had to do. They couldn't honor the request of the parents. So if you have this situation in your house, have this conversation with your children, with your family members who are adults, and if they have indicated on the license, make sure the entire household is on the same page, because if you want to donate and your family doesn't, after the fact, it becomes a very big challenge. But if you're not on the same page, to come on the same page, please go and make that reversal on your driver's license that you have now changed your mind and you don't want to have any organs donated. So it's a valid point that you should have the discussion and then make a decision based on fiqh rulings and logistical issues as well.
Barakallah. That's a very, very valuable information, mashallah. And that's why understanding beyond just the fiqh is so essential in coming to the particularities of this. Yeah. If you don't know what you've done, I can't speak to
It should say on the license, if you have signed up for organ donation, then it should say on the driver's license. Yep.
Okay, yeah. Any last questions from the audience? I don't know if Khalid, I don't have any more questions here, I think, unless I missed some. Oh, yes, brother, okay.
On a suicidal case,
Yeah,
in these days, there are so many drugs
sure,
which have a suicidal effect.
yes,
And a person is very religious, for example, and she is mentally ill or he is mentally ill.
yeah,
And if that person have that after effect of that particular medication,
sure,
and the case will go to the police,
yeah.
in that case, what is the fault of that particular person?
So, our uncle brings up a very important point around the causes of these suicides. And I do agree that in a number of the cases that I've personally dealt with, the situation was one where the person was genuinely unwell for whatever, however you want to kind of diagnose it. But the person was in a very dark place, right? Whether it's due to substance abuse or not. And so therefore, we don't treat this person as if they're some sort of demon, or some sort of like, just someone who's so wantonly trying to disobey Allah. No, this person who went in such a dark place and saw no possibility other than this, whether it was induced or otherwise, then, we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will have mercy on this person, right? And this person is a Muslim. We have to understand, it's not as if this person, you can actually make dua for them. It's not as if you cannot make dua for them. From our practical perspective, from Brother Imtiaz's practical perspective, that's not a dimensionality that is of consideration when it comes to just facilitating the burial process.
When you said that it is announced in the community,
Yes.
and then the community will react the same way. The community does not actually know that particular person. Then what happens?
I'm sorry.
That means you're not going to
Yeah, let me answer her.
Okay. Go ahead.
I think the Sheikh already addressed that if the community is not aware of the cause of death,
When they went to the police case, then what happens?
so that is still within the household, right? It doesn't come to the masjid until somebody brings it to the masjid. So in the masjid, it will be treated like any other case. Unless the family or somebody else brings it to the masjid and it is known to the community at large, then it becomes an issue. Then the imam will not lead the salah. The salah will still be performed, salat al-janaza will take place, but a common man from the congregation will stand up and lead, even if it is known out in the community. Salat al-janaza will still take place, the imam may not lead the salat al-janaza.
It's just, this is a practical fiqhi matter. This is not assigning any existential attributions to this person. What will happen between them and Allah is between them and Allah. No, that's not our business. But that's why, like for example, the question that was asked about someone who doesn't believe in Allah. I'm not going to get in between them and Allah. But I have a practical measure, which is this person a Muslim or not? If they are Muslim, then they have rights. We have to turn on an engine and fulfill their religious rights. If this person is not Muslim from an external perspective, we're not getting into the heart. Someone says, I'm a kafir, but inside said, La ilaha illallah, I don't know that. So I have to treat them as a non-believer. And therefore, I cannot give them these rights. Because they're due to Muslimin. So in the case of the person's suicide, they are Muslim. So they get these rights. But the fiqh has taught us the practicalities of how to facilitate these rights. I hope that's clear, inshallah. Yes, sister. You want to give the mic? I can hear you. Okay, go ahead. Okay. Yeah. So the sister made a wish to be buried back home.
So sister was in the final stages of cancer, so she made a wish to be buried back home. Okay. Only the husband knew about it. So the community all made arrangements to bury locally because we wanted to do best as a community. Of course, she suffered a lot and she had to be buried immediately. People started making arrangements, talked to the masjid to start the proceedings because she was sick for a long time. Everyone just want the janaza done. Then the question came, husband brought it up that she had a will or she made a will or this wish to me to be buried back home, do the embalming and travel back home all the way. At that point, what do you follow? As a religion, yes, we all want to follow to do the janaza and bury immediately, but do you not honor then the will or the wasiyat of the person who passed away?
No, you don't always absolutely honor the will of the wasiyat. No. If the preference of the Sharia is in contrary to what the person wished for, then the Sharia is given precedence. All right? So if you decide as a family, no, you're going to bury her here, then that's fine. You haven't broken any sacred promises, right? Maybe as a husband, it's very hard because I've seen people who've committed that, for example, they'll never drink caffeine to their, and the person has died 10 years ago, and they're like, no, I promised them before they die I'm not going to drink caffeine again. MashaAllah. So that's like an emotional thing. but that doesn't have Shar'i implications. I have two questions here about morphine and end of pain care, end of life pain management. All of those medications are fine within the confines of, it can't be medications that speed up the process. If it's just to mute mute the pain, then that's fine. But it can't be like an accelerant, right? Although there's some like wishy-washy, not wishy-washy, but there's some conversation, are these technically accelerants or not? But regardless, inshallah, it's case to case once again, but generally speaking, it's jaiz. Can a lady do ghusl for the deceased during her period? Yes, a woman who is on her menses can wash another woman. That's jaiz, it's fine. It's not a condition to be in a state of tahara to do the janaza ghusl. I think we're, okay, last question, inshallah. Yeah, last question, that's it. Can the husband and wife do ghusl for each other? There's a difference of opinion on this. The recommended thing is that that should not be the case. From a recommended perspective, from the Sharia, women should wash women, men should wash men, and we'll leave it at that, inshallah.
Sheikh, there are exceptions, like in COVID.
Yes.
Nobody else available.
Yeah. No, that's what I'm saying. There is fiqh that does technically allow it. I'm very open about the fiqh, so I don't like to hide things. Technically speaking, you can, and there are exceptions that may be the only person who can do it and things of that nature. Certainly, if this is the only qualified person to do the ghusl, then it becomes an obligation for them to do the ghusl.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's not culture. That's actually technically fiqh as well. Yeah, I mean, and the Hanafi school is pretty big on this. So the Hanafi school, death, makes it where this woman becomes, or a man becomes non-mahram. Yeah, this is not culture. This is actually Islamic law. But that's what I'm saying. There's multiple opinions. But that's why I'm saying the recommended standard practice is that the men wash the men, the women wash the women, and we just leave it at that. That's the most standard operative fiqhi practice. But there's some detailing, as the brother said, can be exceptions to that depending on the circumstance. By the way, that ruling that they become non-mahram is not all the madhahib, just some of the madhahib who believe that. All right? Yes, we're done. Okay, we're done. I'm getting a lot of X's and this and. We're talking about death, and I'm getting a lot of this. Barakallahu feekum. Just a little joking to, lighten the load. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us a beautiful ending to our lives. We're not here, we're not a morbid community. We're just talking about a very important aspect of our existence, which is the end of life. So we pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to fulfill our rights for our brothers and sisters in the best possible way. May He grant us the knowledge and bestow us with the understanding that will ensure that we fulfill our rights in a manner that's most critically pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us husnul khitam, the most beautiful and excellence of endings in this existence. Barakallahu feekum wa jazakumullahu kull khair. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa akhiru da'wana anil hamdulillahi rabbil alameen.